Hello, I'm Jack Blanchard.
And I'm Dasha Burns. It is Tuesday, June 17th.
And this is the Playbook podcast. Good morning, Dasha.
Good morning.
There is a lot going on. Everyone knows what the big story is today. President Donald Trump is not at the G7 summit. He is back in Washington, D.C., cutting short his trip to the G7 because he needs to engage with the conflict happening in the Middle East. And we are going to spend this podcast talking about that. A couple of other things just to flag on your radar before we get into that. Senators are meeting today for a classified security briefing following the assassinations in Minnesota at the weekend. That's obviously a huge deal on the Hill. Still lots of conversations about those killings, obviously on many Congress people's mind for obvious reasons. Third thing happening on the Hill today, more meetings about the reconciliation bill. We saw a load of new details of the Senate GOP's tax plans last night, and we're likely to see much more debate about that today. But let's talk about the big story, Dasha. An absolute jaw dropper out of the G7 last night. The meeting seemed to be going pretty normally for Trump. He signed a trade deal or sort of a trade deal with the UK, and he spouted off about this and spouted off about that, and then suddenly he's coming home.
This was obviously a conversation heading into the G7. We didn't know just how critical this moment was going to be. What I'm hearing from my sources in the White House is that right now, we've been trying to figure out, I think over the last several days, who are the major influential voices in the room is sort of one perspective here, winning out, who is trying to coax him to do what. It seems from what I'm hearing that he really is hearing from all of the different factions right now. He's talking to military leaders. He's talking to folks in intel. He's really considering all of the options at the moment. And the White House, the source that I'm talking to, are pointing to what they say has been a consistent position from President Trump on Iran, basically since 2011, when he wrote in his book that Iran could not have a nuclear weapon, that is something that should be prevented at all costs. I think right now, the massive question that we are all chasing as reporters, and I assume from my conversations that the White House is discussing in this moment, is what does at all costs mean exactly?
Exactly right. And it was put very nicely in a New York Times piece last night that essentially what we have now is a president facing an absolutely critical decision, maybe the biggest decision of his presidency. Does he throw military might behind what Israel is doing, and very specifically what Israel wants to do, which is destroy this very deeply buried nuclear enrichment facility that's stuffed inside a mountain inside of Iran that only, we believe, American bombs could get at. And Israel wants America to dive in and do that. And at that point, America is going to war with Iran, and that would be a very, very big deal indeed. Or is President Trump going to try and use this moment of maximum leverage over Iran to get them back to the negotiating table and sign some sort of agreement that avoids any sort of US military action?
So I very recently got off the phone with someone very close to the White House who's saying that what is being put out publicly right now is what it looks to be the president trying to deter Iran, trying to bring them to the table. Now, that only works if the threat is real, if he's actually willing to go through with any sort of threat toward Iran. And the question of what that threat is also something we are going to be watching for, because there are these two poles right now of let's keep this at arm's length, let's avoid this at all costs, let's kind of wipe our hands of this conflict, let Israel go it alone, or the regime change, like let's get in there and go whole hog. There is a faction that sees a potential, say, aerial bombardment as something that we could do and sort of call it a day, that we are not putting boots on the ground, that it is not forward deploying to defend American interests, but it is an assist to Israel that doesn't put us all the way in. But I think even that is completely debatable, and what kind of doors that opens up depends on who you talk to, right?
Right. I mean, it might go that way, but we've seen it so many times before. One thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing. Once you cross that threshold, and that will be another voice in Donald Trump's ear saying that, right?
Absolutely right. And I think that's the kind of thing that would really alarm a lot of the America First base if we are seen as dropping bombs on Iran and opening the floodgates to something, if that's how it's seen and if that's how it's messaged. However, if it's like this is a limited deployment of aerial bombardment, and that's kind of where it ends in terms of American involvement, could be different. But again, once you open that door, what else comes through?
Sitting here now recording this in the early hours of Tuesday morning, we don't know what President Trump is going to do. The fact that he put on Truth Social at 6:30 last night, everyone should immediately evacuate Tehran, exclamation mark, doesn't sound like someone who's expecting many more days of negotiations. And I have to say, dashing back from a summit halfway through, again, you might do that to go into a negotiation, but feel like the actions of somebody who is planning to take action themselves. I mean, for the president of the United States to be tweeting everyone should evacuate one of the major cities in the Middle East, that is a big, big deal. And we saw the footage last night of extreme miles of cars, of traffic jams, of people trying to get out of Tehran because they don't know what's coming.
Well, but that's again where, given how President Trump does business, that could be twofold. It could be deterrence, like we are serious about this, get out of Iran because we are pissed and we could take action here, but, right, or get out of Tehran, we're about to take action here, period, end of sentence. You could read it either way. And I think there is active conversation within the White House right now of like, how far are we taking this?
You spent last year on the campaign trail, Dasha, watching President Trump making his stump speech over and over again. How many times did you hear him say to the American people, no more foreign wars, I'm going to get us out of this sort of thing, I'm the anti-war guy, I'm a peace guy?
Mm-hmm.
It would be hard for him to square what he said, wouldn't it, if he did go ahead and take action in Iran this week?
It's a fundamental core tenet of MAGA. Make America Great Again, America First, all of the catchphrases that the president takes credit for. And this is where, again, it is a very difficult needle for the president to thread politically, but he's also sitting behind that desk right now. He is not on the campaign trail, right? He is making real life and death decisions that are going to potentially reshape the world order.
Let's talk about the ongoing debate about this within the sort of MAGA world, because this has been the hottest topic of the last few days. If you follow any of those podcasts or any of those social media streams, people taking very, very strong positions on either side of this. It was interesting to me to see Marjorie Taylor Greene, the extremely pro-Trump congresswoman, coming out in defense of Tucker Carlson, the podcaster who had taken a pretty strong stance against Donald Trump. We saw her doing that yesterday. That to me was just indicative of a movement that is actually being split down the middle by this situation.
And you've got Laura Loomer going after Tucker Carlson and going after his kid even and calling it nepotism and being really angry
His
that
kid
Tucker
works for JD Vance.
Yeah, his kid works for JD Vance. So you do have this fracture within not just the Republican Party, but within MAGA on how to respond to this. You have Mark Levin on one side saying, like, let's get in there and do regime change. You have Tucker Carlson saying this could be the end of the world as we know it, of America as we know it, if we get ourselves involved in this. And President Trump brushing off Tucker Carlson yesterday, saying, you know, maybe he should go get a real show and people would actually listen. However, all of these people, there are people within the White House that have different opinions, of course, but that's within the West Wing. And those players are largely presenting the president right now with a range of options. But these outside folks, boy, they have a lot of influence. They have a lot of followers that are the ones who make up the base for the president. And so, again, you can see sort of the practical and the political coming to a head here.
It's always seemed impossible that there could be anything that sort of schismed Donald Trump away from his people. You know, the devotion amongst Trump voters for the man himself has just seemed completely unstoppable. Could this be a thing that actually causes some of those people to actually start to question Donald Trump for the first time? And like, is he really the right guy?
Well, and guess what? This isn't DEI. This isn't trans issues. This isn't some cultural battle. This isn't rhetoric alone, right? These are legitimate, consequential, big topics that we are talking about. Again, life and death. And I think that, again, is the difference, you know, following him on the campaign trail and hearing him talk about all of these things and making all of these promises. I don't care who you are. Once you sit behind that desk and once you're in the situation room and you're the one calling the shots, it gets a whole lot more complicated, especially when you have this real array of very passionate factions who will, if you take it to a certain extent, bring their pitchforks, even if you're their favorite guy. So it is a serious, solemn moment for the president and for this White House. It is also a pressure cooker moment for the MAGA movement.
couple of other voices in Donald Trump's ear. One, of course, very important voice will be the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, who flew back with Trump to DC last night. We don't know where Rubio is on this, but this new double-hatted role that he's got, he takes on an outsized importance in conversations like these, right?
Well, one of the reasons why some folks in the White House close to President Trump, people like Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, were confident in bringing Rubio into the fold in this expanded role is because they felt, even though he's taken positions that may have differed from that of President Trump in the past, that he's been able to put that stuff aside and present him with an array of options when it came to a bunch of other national security and global issues, that he's been able to really be the convener of voices, the person that distills the different options for the president in a pretty neutral way. So I'd be hesitant to say that neocon Rubio is the one that is speaking right now. I think he has, from what I've heard from my sources, put that to the side a bit as he's been in this dual role and really tried to bring to the table, here's where all of the different things are at. You, Mr. President, make the decision.
The other array of voices we'll hear from today will be in Congress, where lots of MAGA people there, and indeed lots of Democrats there, very unsettled by what may or may not be about to transpire. And we've seen a number of Congress people. Thomas Massey, the Libertarian GOP congressman, bringing forward a bipartisan bill today calling for Congress to essentially step in and outlaw any military action. Congress, of course, holds those powers. Whether we'll see a vote today, we don't know, but we'll certainly hear a lot from Congress people on this. Doesn't feel to me like Donald Trump's main ear to the ground is listening to what Congress says on stuff like this, Dasha.
No, but I mean, traditionally, a lot of this would function via and
constitutionally, in fact.
constitutionally. But, we have seen all of that precedent upended. And by the way, on the Hill, you have very similar divides as you have on the internet right now. You have plenty of Republicans and Democrats that feel a certain way about this and are expressing their voices right now. This really is, it feels like the most consequential moment for Trump yet, both politically and in terms of just pure, raw policy and consequence.
You bet. Let me just give the flip side. I sort of made the case for why he might actually do it earlier with some of the comments he'd made, the statement on Truth Social as well. I would also say, having listened to some of the other leaders who were at the G7 when Trump left yesterday, seemed to be reasonably pleased and supportive that he was going. What they seemed to be saying was that, this is a time for diplomacy. We need the United States president involved in this. Sounded like the messaging that they'd got from him was that he was going there to make a deal. He also talked about Iran coming to the table yesterday and said they're essentially ready to negotiate. So I really feel like where we're at right now is that this one could go either way. And we just have to sit and watch and wait and see what the president does over the next 48 hours, I guess.
I think that's absolutely right. And this is, what I was saying earlier is like, he is making the threats. At the same time, we know from our earlier reporting, this is not the situation he wanted. He really did want a diplomatic solution here. He's still hopeful for that. He wants to keep everyone from the brink here. But given everything that Israel is doing right now and how hot the area is in general, that might not be possible. And so anything could break the camel's back here.
And just last thing I wanted to say about G7 before we finish, Dasha, spare a thought for Volodymyr Zelensky. They feared in Ukraine that when this Middle East conflict first broke out in Gaza, that they were going to become the sort of forgotten victim in a way of what was happening. He was due to have what he will have seen as absolutely vital crisis talks with Donald Trump today at the G7. Kyiv's still getting bombed nightly by the Russians, and that is now not happening, and no one is talking about Ukraine, and we don't see him anywhere remotely close to peace in Ukraine, as Donald Trump had, of course, promised would have happened by now.
Right. Of course, none of this happens in a vacuum. Something blowing up in one part of the world means another part of the world is overshadowed. And plus, you've got all of these proxies, right? And who is supporting whom where and what that ripple effect is going to look like.
All right, Dasha, let's leave it there. Thanks so much for that. That was great. That's all we've got time for on today's Playbook podcast. We have much more news and analysis in today's Playbook newsletter, which you can find at politico.com/playbook. We'll be back tomorrow. Have a great Tuesday.
Take care, guys.